Hello, and welcome to the Daily Rings of Power podcast, your daily dose of the latest news, rumours, and speculation about the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power. The day is Monday, August 8th, and I'm your host, Harry. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. And what an excellent week it is when we are now only 25 days from the Rings of Power being on our screens. After such a long wait, it almost doesn't feel real. As those of you who follow me on Twitter know, this is going to be a slightly different episode. As I was out the country this weekend, I didn't have time for a full scripted episode. Instead, I asked you, the listeners, to submit some quick-fire questions to me on Twitter. I'm going to do my best to answer them, but these won't be in-depth answers, and I plan to return to some of these topics in future episodes. Hopefully, you'll still find this an enjoyable listen, and perhaps we can do more Q&A episodes in the future. However, despite the unscripted format, that doesn't mean we've abandoned reason for madness, so we'll still be opening today's episode with a reading from the Professor's work. Today, our reading comes from the Silmarillion, the Valaquenta. Melkor was jealous of him, for Aule was most like himself in thought and in powers, and there was long strife between them, in which Melkor ever marred or undid the works of Aule, and Aule grew weary in repairing the tumults and disorders of Melkor. Both, also, desired to make things of their own that should be new and unthought of by others, and delighted in the praise of their skill. But Aule remained faithful to Eru, and submitted all that he did to his will, and he did not envy the work of others, but sought and gave counsel. Whereas Melkor spent his spirit in envy and hate, until at last he could make nothing, save in mockery of the thought of others, and all their works he destroyed if he could. While this might be a slightly unusual reading for this podcast, as you'll see in a moment, I wanted to offer a reminder of the futility of hate and the joy of creating new and unthought of things. Before we dive into listener questions, I have to take a few moments to discuss a recent story that has kicked up fresh controversy. Last week, an article came out from The Hollywood Reporter featuring some quotes from Peter Jackson about how Amazon Studios had at one point reached out to him to see if he had any interest in being involved with their potential series. Despite the actual facts of the article being only mildly newsworthy, the publication decided to pair it with an inflammatory headline. While the term clickbait is often overused these days, I find it hard to choose another word to describe this situation. The facts of the article were very simple. Amazon had contacted Jackson to see if he had interest. He replied that he couldn't give an answer without seeing some scripts. Amazon never followed up with a secondary communication, and that was it. The story offers additional speculation on why the conversation didn't go further, but we have no on-the-record answers from the studio. Now, when you hear the facts like that, I'm sure you can appreciate why such a headline does its own journalists a disservice. While I have no wish to drive traffic to this article, it is a good opportunity to discuss two things. Who gets to adapt, and what is fandom entitlement and ownership got to do with all of this? There is often a misplaced expectation that those given the reins of a new adaptation of any work must in some way pay homage to those that came before, and that the previous adapter is owed some kind of deferential treatment. This is of course quite ridiculous. At the very most, one should be deferential towards the original creator of the work, or in the case of Tolkien, the estate that now manages it. Just as Jackson was under no obligation to adopt some form of reverence for Bakshi, the same is true now of Payne and McKay. I've said this so often on Twitter that I do apologise if you're tired of hearing it. But the joy of adaptations is seeing the original work through a new lens. Not only are Payne and McKay not obligated to try and walk in Jackson's footsteps, it would be a huge mistake to do so. As fans, the best way to treat adaptations is not only as significantly separate from the original work, but also even more separate from any previous adaptations. This is the only way to adequately judge the new show on its own merits, rather than simply comparing it on what has come before. As for fans, We've seen over the last year the increasing levels of vitriol and hate from certain sections of the internet. Now, I know this is largely driven by creators sculpting content to purposely whip up outrage, and we're not going to dive into their myriad of bad faith critiques. These people who are obsessed with the skin color of actors or believe that the inclusion of more female characters with actual storylines is some kind of woke agenda are not worth engaging with, and I encourage you all to largely ignore them. But what I do want to say is that no fan or group of fans owns the keys to this fandom. More importantly, no one has the right to say what is and isn't a valid adaptation to someone else. When you hear people call this show fanfiction, it is worth remembering the line between adaptation and fanfiction is really just a question of whether a work is licensed or not. New creative engagement with an original work should always be encouraged. And just because an adaptation holds a special place in your heart, perhaps even in your childhood, does not give you the right to dictate that new and subsequent adaptations are inferior for everyone else, especially before we've even seen a single minute of continuous footage. Now, I apologize for the sermon, and now that it's over, let's dive into the listener Q&A that I promised on Friday. Andy asks, what is your favourite costume, set, weapon that's been revealed so far, and your favourite character that isn't Celebrimbor? My favourite costume would have to be Gil-galad's golden robes and laurel crown. It's just incredibly striking. As for the set, I would have to say the brief glimpses of the Númenórean throne room look incredibly impressive in terms of the scale. And as for weapon, I would have to say Galadriel's dagger with the two trees of Valinor design on the pommel. It's been striking since day one. And favourite character would have to be Elrond. Emily asks, do you think Celeborn and Celebrian will appear in this season or a later one? And will they have a substantial role to play? I don't think either will appear this season. I think Celeborn will likely be introduced in Season 2. As for their role, I imagine it will largely revolve around Galadriel's journey from being obsessed with the idea of fighting to save what she loves, instead to where we find her in Unfinished Tales, where she's trying to preserve what she loves. And I think the role of her family will play an important part in that. Emily also asks, who do you think Adar might be? How do you think he's involved with the Southlander plotline, if he's involved at all? Is it really the man from Bronwyn's village marching alongside Adar, and are they marching over the bridge to the Watchtower? We've covered a lot of this in episode 2, but yes, I do think the whole of the Adar plot is taking place in the Southlands. Everything from the Watchtower to Bronwyn's village and the Orc camp, I think it's all going to be in close proximity. As for how he's involved, I imagine that Adar is after the broken shadow blade in Theo's possession. I don't really have any ideas why. It could be for his own purposes, or I have also wondered whether he is already working under Sauron's orders, and maybe it has some significance to Sauron. Okay, May says, not really a question, but I do want to know your thoughts on the time compression, from what little info we have, and how you think that'll pan out in the end. I covered time compression a little bit in episode 5 when I talked about my worries and fears. I do think the primary effect will be the change in emphasis from a story that is structural to personal. What I mean by that is that Tolkien's Second Age story is incredibly impersonal most of the time, and is largely a recounting of events and dates, so we don't get dialogue, inner thoughts, emotions, any of that. I think the show was never going to be able to cover that length of time, but instead it can portray those major events and what they meant to people on an individual level. On a practical level, I think we'll also avoid some of the repetitious elements of the Second Age. So if you think about the fact that within the Second Age storyline, Sauron is defeated twice by the Númenóreans. So you have the Númenóreans coming in twice, first with Tar Minster, who defeats Sauron and pushes him back to Mordor, and then later Pharazôn, who defeats him and Sauron surrenders. I think there's no reason to have that repetition in the show, and so instead it will be more likely that Sauron's sack of Eregion in the show will be shortly or soon after followed by Pharazôn's invasion and the eventual surrender. So that's one example of how I think it might play out. It's difficult to say how it will work for every storyline, but that could be an example. The Wizard on Wheels asks, if Cirdan is introduced in later seasons, will they give him a beard? Or, for a serious question, which actress performance are you most looking forward to seeing in the show? I've probably said this before, but I'm not that fussed about hair or eye colour or whatever being accurate in the show to the books. It just never bothers me. But I do think it would be cool to have a bearded elf, especially if they give him, a long, glorious beard. That's a yes from me. The performance I'm looking forward to the most is actually Cynthia Addai-Robinson as Miriel. It's largely because Tolkien gives us so little detail about Miriel. And I think she has the potential to have one of the most interesting and complex storylines. And I just can't wait to see what Cynthia does with that. So while there are characters I'm more interested in, that's a performance I really want to see. Millie asks, favourite character per age. This is a tough one. First age, I would have to say, and this may surprise some people, it's actually Mithros. He's a character who seems to swing between hope and doom constantly, and his tragic arc is one of my favourites from the Legendarium. And also, the fact that I like and care about one of the Feanorians really says something from my perspective. Although I would extend that to Maglor as well. His story just isn't as interesting to me as Mithros's. Second age would have to be Elrond. His personal journey from being an orphan at the beginning of the age to the wise lawmaster of Rivendell by the third age, it's one that fascinates me to no end. So even though there are other more interesting stories, he is my favourite character from the second age. Third age has to be Frodo for me. The courage of Frodo is something that's inescapable, and I think while there are lots of amazing third age characters, for me, Frodo is and always will be the beating heart of that story, and the beating heart of all of Tolkien's works, really. Okay, we've got a fun one here. Jules asks, why do you hate hobbits? For legal reasons, I will say I don't hate hobbits, but I do hate their feet. Their feet are gross and disgusting, and I wish both Jackson and now these new showrunners would stop showing us them. I don't care. Put some shoes on them, don't put shoes on, but just stop showing me close-ups of hobbit feet and half-foot feet. I don't want to see it. As for the rest of hobbit life and hobbit culture, it seems pretty great to me, so I've got no criticisms there. Arenion asks several questions. So first up, Na'vi has such a little role, but it's a major one in Tolkien's writings. How would you make use of the character in the show? I would probably leave Na'vi out if I was running the show. His function in Tolkien's story is actually fairly simple. Beyond creating the Doors of Durin, he's really just the dwarf who's there to be friendly with Celebrimbor. I think in the show you can neatly give that role to either one of the Durins, and it has the same effect. Plus, it will then be a character who has more of an arc. I think Na'vi just isn't an interesting character to me, honestly. Second question, less serious. How would you imagine the Massacre of the Harfoots? I imagine this, well, at least I hope this is probably a joking question, but I am very worried for the Harfoots, and I'll be honest, I do have a bad feeling that before this series ends, we may see some of them hunted for sport by orcs. I don't want to say that, but I do have a bad feeling about that. And then he asks, Arenion asks, would you dress up in this costume for your wedding? And it's Gil-galad's golden costume. Although I did say this is my favourite costume from the show so far, I would love to wear this outfit, but Benjamin Walker is a mountain of a man, and I simply do not have his frame or his shoulders to pull off this regal outfit. I think if we're talking Elrond's outfits, I would absolutely wear one of those to a wedding. Eowyn, the CEO of Faramir, asks, what could the story be behind that sword Theo holds? I'm extremely intrigued and confused. Honestly, we talked about this a little bit before, but this is a blind spot for me. I don't even know if we'll ever get an exact answer of what it is, but I imagine that it's a relic that Sauron forged in the First Age. We've seen from the official clip with Galadriel and Gigwit that they're already leaning into the idea of Sauron as a craftsman and a smith, so it could be a way of linking that back to the story and having an evil object corrupt the holder, which is a bit of a trope that we see throughout Tolkien's writings. I don't know if there'll be an exact story behind the sword, but I think the point of the sword is what it's going to do for these characters moving forward. Eragon04 asks, what aspect are you most looking forward to in the series? If we're going for a single aspect, beyond anything else, I'm interested to get a perspective on what these characters were thinking and feeling in the Second Age. Without any close narrative or really any dialogue for most of the telling, the books leave me in the dark in that respect. I'm very curious to see Isildur's journey as a tragic hero, for example, but not for the events of that story. I want to see his emotional journey, so it's that aspect of the show that really compels me. Next up, Lynn Caswell Ford asks, do you think we will get to see Elros Tar Miniator in the show? Where do you expect the show will ultimately conclude, the Gladden Fields, or after that even? As for Elros, I doubt we'll see him, but if I could wish for a scene with him, it would be a flashback to the conversation where he tells Elrond that he will choose a mortal life. I think the possibilities for that kind of scene would be really exciting, but otherwise I don't know what the purpose of a scene with Elros would be. As for the ending of the whole series, I would definitely end with the Gladden Fields. I think it's a really powerful moment to end on, but it may be a bit negative, a bit downbeat, so maybe they'll end with something more positive and hopeful. But if I was the show, I would tell the story of the Gladden Fields, and I would try and get the rights so that I could tell the full version from Unfinished Tales, because that is actually for me one of the most beautiful and moving stories from Tolkien's writings. Emma Victory asks, what scene from a Second Age event which I can see clearly in my head do I hope we'll see on the screen? Well, this won't be for a few seasons, but for me it's actually Sauron's surrender to Pharazôn. To me, that's a crucial moment the story has to nail, and it has to make us believe that Pharazôn doesn't see the mistake he's making, and that Sauron really does convince people that he's throwing himself at their mercy, and, it has to really work. For me, it's one of those scenes that could make or break the show. Non-Sequitur Girl asks, of the ancient kingdoms we've now seen bits of, so Númenor, Lindon, Khazad-dûm, which are you most excited to see and explore? I'm probably most excited for Númenor because I think it will have the richest sense of an actual society and political system. I know we'll be getting more of Khazad-dûm than we've ever had, and I'm really excited for that. But Númenor gives us the most opportunity to see one of these kingdoms at a street level. Not to mention, it's the one, for me, where there's actually the best story in terms of the kingdom. Lindon, I'm very excited for the characters there, but do I think we'll get much of an interesting story in terms of the politics or the people of Lindon? Maybe they'll surprise me, but I don't think so. Okay, Liz the Frizz, great name, asks, what other creatures, apart from Ents, Wargs, and Balrogs, do you think we'll see in the series? Honestly, I'd be surprised if the show goes too heavy on the creature front. I do think it was a mistake in the Hobbit films to just keep adding more each film. We already had the dragon and Beorn and everything else, and I felt like Jackson maybe just got a bit carried away. In terms of this show, we could see a dragon in a First Age flashback. That does seem like a stretch to me. I think more likely we may see some classic Tolkien creatures, so on the good side, that probably means some eagles, and then on the bad and scary side, I would not rule out if we saw some spiders. Although, now that I'm thinking about it, we do know we're going to see more types of trolls from the footage we've already seen, and a sea monster from the trailer. So, who knows? Maybe I'm totally wrong on this one, and we're going to get some weird, wild, and wonderful creatures over the next 5 years, but I doubt it. Azul asks, do you know how long is each episode, or how many episodes we're getting? We don't know either answer for the whole series. We know that season 1 is 8 episodes, and we know the show is aiming for 50 hours of television. So you can probably expect some episodes each season to be a little bit longer than an hour, maybe some to be a bit shorter, if they hold to that plan, but the 50 hours, I would imagine, is more of a rough goal. So we could see some seasons with more episodes, some with less. I honestly don't know. We'll have to wait and see. Okay, Nils Dubzinski asks, is it confirmed that the priestess-looking lady is Sauron? The short answer is no. While some of us speculated that was Sauron when we first saw the trailer, and to be honest, I believed it initially. I really liked the aesthetic choice there. It's not been confirmed, and now most people seem to agree that it isn't. I tend to side with the smart folk who say that this is most likely a cultist or priestess. Either they're worshipping Sauron himself or maybe Morgoth. It may be part of Season 1's wider arc of establishing Sauron's influence through his followers and his lieutenants, and those he's already corrupted, another example of these obviously being Adar. So this may be a case of we're going to see multiple people and multiple figures who are working for or with Sauron, but we won't see him till the very end of the season, or maybe even the start of Season 2. And finally, Jesse Sunderland asks, could Bronwyn be getting a Ring of Power in the future? It makes a lot of sense, there's no mention of gender for all the ringwraiths, and love for an elf is an easy reason for wanting immortality. Sauron could also promise that he could save her son or her people with a ring. Yeah, I love this theory. I think it's certainly possible. I think both the reasons you give, the love for Arondir and for her son, could be a great motivation. I would love to see that. I think that would be a super interesting story, and it would be a much darker take on the Andreth and Aignor love story, where instead of them both dying, one in battle, the other of mortality, you could still have Arondir dying, but Bronwyn trying to save their love or herself or her people through the ring. I do also think it's equally possible that Bronwyn may not survive for more than a couple of seasons in the show, and actually it's her death that would lead Theo to accept a ring from Sauron. Either way, I think the Southlands storyline is bound to show us at least one future ringwraith this season. Whether that's Bronwyn or Theo, or maybe even Halbrand, I'm not sure, but I think we're going to be introduced to some future ringwraiths this season, and it'll be interesting to see if we have a better idea by the end of the season. That's all the questions I had time for, and actually I know this episode is going to run quite a bit longer than 15 minutes, but hopefully you don't mind too much. As always, I'd greatly appreciate if you could leave a rating or review on whichever podcast platform you use. It really helps spread the show to new potential listeners, and will once again broaden our community so that we can have more great discussions like this in future. If you'd like to discuss any of the questions and answers we talked about today on Twitter, drop me a comment below this post. It would be great to go back and forth about some of these answers, or whether you want to offer some additional questions or topics for future episodes. I'd be more than happy to do that. Thank you so much for listening. I will be back tomorrow, as always, with more discussion of the latest news on the Daily Rings of Power podcast. Namaria.